Okay, so last week was Easter. The Friday, Good Friday, happened to also be the first Friday of Passover. I guess Passover concluded yesterday, right? So it's 7 days, I think.
8 days.
8 days.
7 days inside Jerusalem, I believe 8 days.
Oh yeah, I forgot about, they always do that weird. Anyway, so so right now in the Jewish liturgy or calendar, we're in a season called the Counting of the Omer. It's about 6 weeks between Passover and Shavuot. So Shavuot is most commonly known as the Festival of Weeks. And that's about all I looked up for it.
And in the Christian calendar, it's
It's Pentecost, right? So, because Shavuot, besides being Festival of Weeks, is also considered the time when Moses ascended to Mount Sinai and received the Torah. Right, so you have the Passover, which is at the Exodus, and then you have the receiving of Torah. And we see that kind of mirrored, right, because of the idea of Christ performing his Exodus, which is, I guess, not a language we use often, with us and everyone else. And then we see the Spirit of God descending for Pentecost. So during the season, I don't really know much about the counting of the Omer. That just happens to be where it's at. So a tradition during this period is to go through a book, part of the Mishnah called the Avot. It's often read on its own called Pirkei Avot, which means ethics of our fathers. Avot is a word that can be translated as fathers or like categories. And so it's kind of become a tradition to read it during this time of year. It's the ethics of our fathers altogether, 6 chapters, and so it's about one for every Sunday between the 6 weeks. Some traditions have you continuing through the summer, all the way up to Rosh Hashanah. There's some other traditions that you read at certain points in the year when you're going through Exodus, but we're going to do it now. Any questions so far? People following along? So this is just opening into it.
So, vote, A-D-O-T.
Yeah.
P-I-R-K-E-I.
The I's optional,
And then
but I always like to include.
A-B-O-T.
Yes, and I happen to have learned while preparing for tonight, so I bought a Mishnah for this. First I borrowed Don's, and then bought the same one as him, and then it came, so I gave his back, and my Mishnah's in my car. And going through different websites, Chabad, Jewish Learning, and Chabad, was like, oh, this is in fact so common to go through liturgically that most Sidurs or prayer books have it. And I was like, I got a Siddur. And so I was like, this is so handy. I was like, oh, this is so handy. I was like, I just have one here and I can open it up and didn't even need to buy that Mishnah or the other version of Person Favorably that I bought, but that's okay. So the Mishnah, so at Sinai, we received the Torah, which is considered traditionally the first 5 books, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And there's tradition that the Mishnah was also received. The Mishnah is considered the oral Torah. And so I'm going to read, and we'll see that a little bit in Pirkei Avot. I'm probably just going to refer to it as Avot because I'm much more confident about how to pronounce that word than the first word. So anyway.
You could also just say sayings of the fathers.
I could say that, ethics of our fathers, sayings of our fathers, yeah, I could do that as well. So I guess in my idea to go through it this week, I want to imagine a few more people in the audience, so I was going to ask you all to go in if you have your phones, if you have Zoom, to log into the chat and ask you each to contribute at least one question as I go through this. Realizing not everyone had Zoom, you could also just, I thought this way it would be easier so that you don't have to write it down and you don't have to remember it, so that I could read through it. You could ask questions in real time and then we could go back through. There'll be, so I'm gonna read it through in its entirety, and then I will come back to the first verse and kind of start with, I'm gonna give some commentary and see what questions that our audience has. Okay, so does that seem all right with everyone? Okay, so they have this intro verse to it that's not actually part of it. All Israel have a share in the world to come, as it is stated, and your people are all righteous. They shall inherit the land forever. They are the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, in which to take pride. Verse 1. Moses received the Torah from Sinai and passed it on to Joshua. Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets passed it on to the men of the great assembly. They said three things. Be deliberate.
You said to join the video on your phone.
You can pop it.
Yeah.
Don't connect the audio.
Don't connect the audio.
You didn't say that.
I didn't say that.
It's your fault.
It is my fault. I apologize for not reading my fault well. Okay, where is it? And they said three things. Be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence around Torah. Simeon the Righteous was one of the last men of the great assembly. He used to say, the world stands on three things: on the study of Torah, the service of God, and deeds of kindness. Antigonus of Soko received from Simeon the Righteous. He used to say, do not be like servants who serve their master for the sake of receiving a reward, but rather be like servants who serve their master without the intent of receiving a reward, and let the fear of heaven be upon you. Yosei ben Yozer of Tezrei and Yosei ben Yohan of Jerusalem received the oral tradition from them. Yosei ben Yozer of Tezrada said, let your house be a meeting place for sages. Sit in the dust at their feet and drink in their words thirstily. Yosei ben Yohan of Jerusalem said, let your house be wide open for guests. Treat the poor as members of your household, and do not indulge excessively in conversing with the woman. This has been said concerning one's own wife. How much more does it apply to the wife of another? Hence the sages have declared, anyone who indulges excessively in conversation with a woman causes evil to himself, neglects the study of Torah, and will in the end inherit Gehenna. Joshua ben Berechiah and Nitier of Arbel.
Just connecting to the audio.
No. Hey, thanks for distracting me now. Okay, Joshua ben Berechiah and Nitier of Arbel received from them. Joshua ben Berechiah said, provide yourself with a teacher, acquire for yourself a friend, and judge every person favorably. Nitier of Arbel said, keep away from a bad neighbor, do not fraternize with a wicked man, do not abandon belief in retribution. Yehuda ben Tabai and Simeon ben Sacha received from them. Yehuda ben Taba said, do not act as a counselor when sitting as a judge. When the litigants stand before you, regard them both as guilty, and when they leave, having accepted the judgment, regard them both as guiltless. Simeon ben Sacha said, examine the witnesses thoroughly and be cautious with your words, lest through them they learn to speak falsehoods. Simeon and Abtalon received from them. Simeon said, love work, abhor taking high office, and do not seek intimacy with the ruling power. Abtalon said, sages, be careful with your words, for you may incur the penalty of exile and be banished to a place of evil waters, and the disciples who follow you there will drink and die, and consequently the name of heaven will be desecrated. Hillel and Shammai received the oral tradition from them. Hillel said, be disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace, loving your fellow creatures and bringing them near to the Torah. He used to say, he who seeks renown loses his name. He who does not increase his knowledge of Torah decreases it. He who does not study Torah deserves death, and he who exploits the crown of Torah for his own ends shall perish. He used to say, if I am not for myself, who is for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Shammai said, set a fixed time for your study of Torah. Say little and do much. Receive every person with a cheerful countenance. Rabbi Gamliel said, provide yourself with a teacher and free yourself of doubt. Do not tithe by guesswork, even giving in excess of the required amount. Simeon, his son, said, all my days I grew up among the sages and did not find anything better for one's person than silence. Do not study, but practice is the essential thing, and whoever engages in excessive talk brings on sin. Rabbi Simeon ben Gamaliel said, the world endures by virtue of three things: justice, truth, and peace. As it is stated, administer truth and judgment of peace at your gates. Rabbi Hananel, so that's the end of the chapter, and then there's a closing verse. Rabbi Hananiah ben Achaisha said, the Holy One, blessed be he, wished to make the people of Israel meritorious. Therefore he gave them Torah and mitzvot in abundant measure, as it is written, the Lord desired for the sake of his righteousness to make the Torah great and glorious. Ooh. Okay, so that's our first time through. I mentioned some traditions, they suggest doing like just one paragraph a week. So overall, that's 18 verses, so kind of short, which is why I felt comfortable reading out loud. So I'm going to start from the beginning. So you have, I guess, an intro verse. All Israel has a share in the world to come, as it is stated. And your people are all righteous, and they shall inherit the land forever. They are the branch of my planting, the work of my hand, in which to take pride. Verse 1. Moses received the Torah from Sinai, passed it on to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets passed it on to the men of the great assembly. They, the men of the great assembly, said three things: be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence around Torah. So, right, we see this idea of the oral Torah, and we see also this idea of transmission and lineage. Where we end up with Rabbi Simeon ben Gamliel, so this is about shortly after the death of Jesus, right? Because Gamliel is the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, thank you, at the time of Easter. So part of what's important about this start to a vote is this idea of transmission. And we are not just getting this from nowhere, but this is part of our heritage and part of our remembrance, right? And that idea is, we see that kind of reflected in other areas of scripture. So the idea of transmission and lineage being important. So is there any questions to start off?
I guess going with that idea of transmission, just more of a academic or historical question. Was it perceived as if there were one line? So like in the Catholic Church, there's Peter, the first pope, and then all of the popes after them, or like Aaron and the line of priests. Was this seen as like one line? Because I have some vague memory that like, oh, well, there's the school of Hillel and the school of, and so was this drawing from all of those traditions and schools, or was this mostly associated with kind of picking one line
Of thought. Yeah.
of thought?
Okay, so do we all online hear Reed's question? No one has their faces. So if there's no response, I'm going to assume you all heard his question all right. So that is a really good question. Not surprising, because we all ask good questions here. So let me check my notes. So starting in verse, so we see one goes through several people. And they see it, so in the start of, not that you all have this to reference, I put a couple links in the passage, in the chat. So in verse 4, they start having pairs of people. You had Yosef ben Yozer of Tezreda's a city, and Yosef ben Yohan of Jerusalem, right? So two different people. And that pairing is showing two opposing traditions. So for a while there's one, and at some point it becomes two. Some of the commentaries I read said that that shows like, kind of like just, I can't remember what it said, never mind. So anyway, this idea of opposing views and disagreements. And it seemed like, for us, I think it, like, when I read through this, whichever time it was, I read, I don't see much disagreement in them, and I guess I could, have prepped better and gone into that, knowing that these are meant to show opposing views. But part of what we also said, they were saying, is that while Gamaliel, to say some more, Gamaliel and Shammai, Hillel and Shammai had different views, they still had agreements on some things. And so here, while we might not see a lot of disagreement between what they're saying, or like, there's still areas they also overlap. Right, the service is still important, and sometimes it's just how do we do that service that matters, or that's the disagreement. How is that as an answer?
No, that's good. I was just one, yeah, I mean, it answers whether this was something that ultimately was collected by one particular school, or whether it was designed to show like a bipartisan, like we're all the nation of Israel, we're all Judaism, and here are these nuggets from all of our predecessors, no matter what school they're now associated with.
Yeah. So like, right, to go back to this idea of transmission, do we have opposing views? And we see in the Gospels that Jesus is asked, by whose authority do you speak, right? And again, this idea of transmission and lineage shows authority, and that there are different, and by having those pairs, it's showing that both of these people together, and other views, teach that next generation. And that, so in ways that each generation has its own disagreements and opposing views, but that they're still seeking to be the people of God. And that they are still both raising up disciples in the future generations. This is my first time going through the Mishnah, and like this first week, this is like the first week I've ever read a vote. And from what some of the things I was reading said, it sounds like the Talmud has even more, like there are commentaries on this that I think might better answer your question, or might go more deeply into those opposing views, like what does it mean by this, and Yeah. I think there's, if you want to delve into that, I think there's some rabbit trails.
Just really at the end of the day, a vote is kind of like an anthology of thought. And
That's a good one.
the heart of it is, these are the general ethics that exist through our history. And the reason it begins at Sinai is to show that it's all connected right back to that moment, right? Like it's almost that introduction sentence or statement is really trying to establish that this has been the way that the Jewish people have thought since Moses.
I could see a parallel, like if there was a book, like an American book that would say, quotes from our founding fathers and the presidents. And it's like, the founding fathers didn't agree on everything, and there were political parties,
Right.
Some of which don't even exist anymore, but you would put together a book that would just say, well, no, this is like this course of American thought from great thinkers or leaders in America, and it wouldn't say so-and-so Republican, so-and-so Whig party.
Well, it does kind of say that, though.
Right,
Because
when they say,
Hillel and Shammai.
right.
Is those Hillel and Shammai couldn't be further apart in their interpretation of Torah.
Right.
And so, yeah.
But just like you would name a president, Lincoln and Roosevelt, and people would know that they were of different political parties, but you're just presenting them as, but they're common in that they're Americans and they are presidents.
Okay.
17 more verses.
That's okay, we're not gonna, I don't plan on getting to all of them. Right, so that first one just being a good introduction, right, that's our grounding. So second one, Simeon the Righteous, verse 2, was one of the last of the men of the great assembly. He used to say, the world stands on three things: on the study of Torah, the service of God, and deeds of kindness. And so there's more than one translation of the vote of the ethics of our Father. And number 2, and verse 2, I think is really interesting to look at, because that second one that Simeon says, service of God, a lot of it is like temple service, the deeds of the temple. And, right, like, what does that mean in a time when, what does that mean to Simeon, or Simeon that ends this, when there is no temple? An idea, right, that's a theological question that I think the Jews probably had to wrestle with, right? And we can see that in different translations, right? This one talks about service of God, which seems a little more, it's not specific to the temple, right? It's more applicable to our post-temple existence. Okay. Okay.
I see that a little bit like when we read in Scripture, it's kind of like an argument about originalism. Like, do we take everything in Scripture to mean only the literal nouns that they're talking about? Or do we say, and in our time, this is the equivalent? And so, if this is one of the foundations, the three things that it rests on, if one of the parts of that foundation literally can't be done, then what does that mean? Does it mean that do you just say, okay, it's impossible to do this anymore? Or do you just say, okay, but what does that mean? What is the intent? What does that mean to me? What is today's equivalent of? And I think different churches, when interpreting the Bible, some of them just say, oh, that's, that dispensation or that teaching has been fulfilled, it's over with, we don't need to do that anymore because it no longer applies literally. And I think a lot of people, whether they intend to or not, treat the Hebrew Bible that way, where they just say, oh, we don't need to really pay attention to that, we don't need to take any lesson from that, or we can pick and choose which parts we just say, well, that can't be done anymore.
So I guess to that I have sort of pushback, right? So I'm focusing in on this part, verse 2. Simeon the Righteous was one of the last men of the great assembly. He used to say the world stands on three things: on the study of Torah, on service of God, and deeds of kindness. And I think if you look at the links I shared, I think it's like, again, it talks more about temple service. So even if this was given, right, to the Israelites who have the temple, how many of them are able to do temple service? How many of them go in there and give the sacrifices? Is every Israelite allowed to give a sacrifice, to slice the goat's throat and perform those ceremonies?
That's why it says the world is one of those three pillars, not each person is on those three pillars.
Yeah. So even in the time they're receiving this, they are receiving it with a very communal mindset that Israel as a whole is to do this, that I as just a lay member can't, that I need my brethren, that I need my community to fulfill this, because I need those Levites who have that special job. And I would say the Levites also need the lay folk as well, right? They have no land holdings. They aren't able to raise up the food and animals needed for sacrifice. They aren't able to raise up the food to even feed themselves, right? So that, we often have this individualistic view, if we go to the time of Maimonides, who codifies Torah into 613 commandments. Even then, it's not about on each of us for having to fulfill all of them, for us as a community to be doing it. And that communal view. And I think that would be worth interesting with the dispensation, right? So we even, in the time of Torah, you have a whole book, Leviticus, mostly directed toward the Levites. But the standard person still studies that book, intensely and significantly, because they are part of that community. So, is that a good response? Does that feel satisfying? Does it generate, good kind of, maybe? Okay. So again,
That's why I ask questions to get response.
I don't know what I really mean when I say good response. I'm like adequately, responding, but also hopefully generating different questions at the same time. I don't want to answer all your questions. But yes, so we see again, even very early in the Ogo, this idea that this is talking to a community, and we are meant to receive it as members of a community. And I just think that's something that's often lost in that shift between modern day Western society, especially in church, right? I'm sure we've all heard, most of us have probably pounded into us the idea of our individual relationship with Jesus, that we forget though that we're part of our community. We talked about this last week, the idea that working out safety and salvation is not an individual, but a community. And so just the idea of keeping that mindset in this scripture, that we are doing this as a community. Okay. So moving on, that was what, verse? So I don't have a verse, something to say for every verse, and I don't expect a question for every verse, but just to let you all know, I'll just read it, go by one. Verse 3, also I'm probably not saying most of these names right, so please just bear with me. Okay, so Antigonus of Sochu received the oral Torah from Simeon the Righteous. He used to say, Do not be like servants who serve their master for the sake of receiving a reward, but rather be like servants who serve their master without the intent of receiving a reward, and let the fear of heaven be upon you. I am making notes for this one, so unless you all have questions, I know that Tiffany had put fear of God in there, so I'm not sure if this is the verse she was meaning.
I think, before you logged in, I had said,
Oh,
question
else.
for later, what should we take fear of heaven to mean? And Tiffany
Fear of
answered
God.
me.
Yeah, probably fear of heaven, have fear of God, although I'm not quite sure what fear of heaven or God means. I've heard a lot of different preachings about it, and I just have not yet found something that's satisfactory enough for me to want to pass on. I've not found any answers or thoughts that have satisfied me about what that means. And that might be from my background, where fear is very much linked to not awe, but to afraidness and terror and like not good feelings. And I've even read, read a little bit of commentary about this verse, and I'm still like, I still don't really understand it. So unless you all have questions, we'll just keep moving along. So verse 4, Yosei ben Yozer of Tendreda and Yosei ben Yohan of Jerusalem received from them. Yosei ben Yozer of Tendreda said, let your house be a meeting place for sages, sit in the dust at their feet, and drink in their words thirstily. So here's where we first see the idea of two teachers. And there's some history about being more the priestly side and more the lay side, but this idea that there's more than one viewpoint, they don't always agree, sometimes they oppose each other, but that they can still learn from someone on the other side. And throughout these pairs of commentaries I was reading, it was talking about how they learn from each other, right? And we've not seen this in this, but the idea of being humble, learning from those around us and from those who come before us. Right, so he says, Yosei ben Yozer, so just to let everyone know background knowledge, Ben usually means son of, so it's saying Yosei, son of Yozer, because you also have Yossi, son of Yohan. So they differentiate by where they're from and who their father are. So Yosei ben Yozer, right, says, let your house be in a meeting place for sages, sit in the dust at their feet and drink in their words thirstily. And when it's saying sages, it's not just talking about people we agree with, but can also be or like sages who support our views, but all the sages, right? To sit at the feet of any sage and all sages, right? Have your, right, like, has anyone heard about like the French salons that used to be around, like, I don't know, I guess they were around for a while, but just like these gatherings of thinkers around, like, an existential cafe in Germany before World War II. Thinkers who disagreed with each other would gather together to debate and talk and share, because that's how they would learn. And we see that tradition strongly throughout the Bible, right? We see that in the days of Jesus, that he is questioned by the Sadducees, and that is not meant as a rebuttal of his authority, but as an acknowledgement of his authority and teaching, because they're saying, hey, let's engage in conversation and learn from each other, right? Questions are a huge part of it. So anyway, this idea, again, just to reiterate, learning from all those around us, even those we might disagree with. Any other questions about verse 4? Okay. Yosei ben Yohan of Jerusalem said, let your house be wide open for guests, treat the poor as members of your household, and do not indulge excessively in conversation with the woman. This has been said concerning one's own wife. How much more so does it apply to the wife of another? Hence the sages have declared, anyone who indulges excessively in conversation with a woman causes evil to himself, neglects the study of Torah, and will in the end inherit Gehenna. So this was the one I was joking about with Don before we got started. So part of what I was saying is that, given the time period, this is mostly directed towards men. All right, men are the sages, men are the thinkers. So, think about your household. If one of you was to say, if you and your partner, one of you was to say, let's have over a bunch of guests, and you think, let's say your partner says that, and then you think to yourself, I'm gonna be the one doing all the cooking, I'm gonna clean up to prepare for this, I'm gonna cook to prepare for this, I'm gonna do all the serving, I'm gonna clean up later. Let's have maybe not as many people as you want. So the idea being that in this age, the man was the one inviting all the guests, and the woman, the wife, is the one doing a lot of the labor. So she is less enthused about being a meeting place for sages and having your doors open to everyone. Right? The woman's burden. So this also shows, though, the idea of exceeding hospitality, or generous hospitality, being exceedingly hospitable, right? Opening your doors to guests, right? Whoever might be in need, and to treat the poor as members of your family. And whatever we have, we will share, even if it's not a lot. I'm into this. So is there any thoughts you all have before I have some more things to say about this one? Nothing about verse 4, nothing about the woman, and so anyway, so it's been said concerning one's wife.
Paul said,
Oh,
Jesus would be in a lot of trouble about this one.
I mean, he doesn't have a partner, so his wife would be.
Well, let me say something, so a more contemporary reading of that isn't that a woman should be talked to. It's implying the way that it's flirtatious. It's like in the same way that if you spent all your time just flirting with your spouse, you would not get the things done you need to get done.
Or arguing with your spouse.
What's that?
Or arguing about having this children, or the two,
Sure.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. The idea of the problem isn't talking with women as sages and studying Torah together. The problem was the idea that men particularly would be distracted by being flirtatious with women. And nothing against the women. It's not the woman's fault that men do that, but that men would actually become distracted from studying Torah because they would be interacting with the women there, and not interacting with them as sages, but interacting with them as gossip or potential partners or whatever. And that's the problem. There's always women in rabbinic writings that were considered wiser than their spouse, who was the sage. We see it constantly throughout rabbinic literature, that the household, the sage would come home and then sit at his wife's feet to learn from her. So I feel like because our patriarchy and misogyny in history has been so bad, that the first thing we want to do, or maybe the last thing we want to do, is to read these types of passages with the benefit of the doubt that God is not dictating that sages shouldn't talk to women. They specifically spoke about the role of the woman as a wife, not as a woman that's there as a sage studying, like I think about Mary Magdalene, right, who is as far as we know, a single woman who's there. So the problem isn't quite the way that on the surface that we read it.
That was going to be a little bit of my next one. So I'll give you an example. I played some days, and Don will invite me and David Schwartz over to play games. David comes over, and he spends the next half hour talking with Tana. David, we're already been here half an hour waiting for you because you're late like usual, and now you're delaying us another half hour by chatting with the person you're not here to see. Go make a coffee date with Tom if that's what you want to do, but we came here for games. Anyway, so I put in the
I
chat.
feel like we're working on a few issues here that maybe David should be present for.
So,
He's on a coffee date with Tom.
Probably.
finally, now I can play some
Finally
games.
listens to you.
Did you turn off the camera?
Oh dear, am I still here?
I think it's when I went to school different.
The owls went away. Oh, are they back now? Okay, good, can you see me? Okay. There we go. So what I was going to get to, and Dawn has already prefaced well, and I think I've talked about this once or twice before, the concept of Lashon Hara, which is kind of the idea of slander, right? You know, you go over somewhere you're going to your friend's house to study about the Bible, you're not going there to, right? And this idea that, right, it can lead to gossip and to slander. And slander in Judaic thought is considered one of the most egregious sins because there's no way to take it back. You've, in some ways, you've spoken evilly, you've killed some part of their character. You have not only done an evil deed to yourself, but you've maligned someone else. You've brought, whoever you're talking to has been brought in. There might be someone listening that you didn't think about.
Can I tell the pillow story?
Ooh, you can tell the pillow story.
So the rabbis, when asked about slander, why they took it so seriously, or gossip for that matter, and it was the rabbi told someone that came to him and said, I told a lie about someone, or I misspoke about someone. How can I get forgiveness? And the rabbi said, take your pillow and go up on top of the hill and open it. And this is at a time when pillows would have been filled with feathers, right? Open it up, dump it out, and bring me the pillowcase. The person does that, they come back to the rabbi with the pillowcase, and the rabbi says, okay, I've done it, what do I need to do now? And the rabbi says, go get all the feathers. And that is kind of like the point of how dangerous it is when we gossip about people, when we say something harmful or mean about someone or something untrue, or we allow lies to be spoken about someone and don't step in, that it implicates us in that way.
And and that's what this last part is driving through. You know, hence the sages have declared anyone who indulges successfully in conversation with a woman causes evil to himself, neglects the story of Torah, and will in the end inherit Gehenna. So it's not which is trash, yes. The idea being that inherit they use, right, and one of the questions in the commentary I was reading was that why use the word inherit? Why not earn, right? You inherit something from someone else. An idea that being when you gossip, right, so when you slander, you're that ripple effect, and you now cause someone else to sin, and you're going to inherit that. You're going to take that from them, and like you're going to end up adding to your trash heap because of what you've done to someone else. You'll inherit their trash as well. Okay.
And everyone goes and closes all their social media accounts right after.
So next, Joshua ben, so going on to verse 6. Joshua ben Paraha and Nitiah of Arbel received from them. Joshua ben Paraha said, provide yourself with a teacher, acquire for yourself a friend, and judge every person favorably. So I didn't write anything down. This one was mostly straightforward, right? We should always be seeking out a teacher. We should always be continually learning. That idea is actually going to come up in the next few verses as well. So
my question on that was, is this an example, because in the second part it very clearly seems to be, but is this an example where when they're stating something they repeat the same thing in two different ways. So when they say teacher and they say friend, is that just saying that a teacher is a friend and vice versa, a friend is a teacher?
No, they do mean a distinction, which in reading my commentary, I'm like, I did not do this well with Don. So the idea that your teacher might be someone you can't always be around a lot. It's someone who might be a little more distant, that you only go to about Torah, someone who's your teacher, not your study buddy, right? And your friend can be your study buddy, and
so where do you see that as being the correct interpretation of this? Because the second part is when they talk about who to avoid, it seems like those are talking about just saying the same thing in two different ways.
It does, and I will put in the one I was looking for at Chabad, and here it is. I kept up all my things I was reading from because I was like, I'll probably need to reference them at some point. Or someone will be asking about questions I can't answer. They distinguish the idea of being an evil neighbor and a bad person, or is it the other way around? Bad neighbor, wicked man. So these sound very similar, and in that question and answer link I just posted, they do talk about like, isn't this redundant? And I want to say Wade's question is great, right? It's getting into that nitty-gritty, being like, why does this repeat itself? Is it for emphasis? Is it for nuance? And that's part, like, those are some of the questions that are integral to some of Judaic study. Right? And in some of the Hebrew, this gets a little more nuanced. I don't know if it's verse 6 or a different one, right? Judge every person favorably. And I think in the Hebrew, this one was saying that's the wording, it seems to be redundant, like judge every person according to the balance of scales, having it be in their favor. And it's sort of like, yes, I think it's this one. And the idea just being like, make sure, right, take a moment to realize you don't know where this person's coming from. You don't know what they meant when they say something, so try and be extra generous in your, be assuming merit and favor towards them, right? Have a positive intent, assume positive intent. I think you used to say something like that a lot, right?
Because of that.
Yeah. Something I did say towards the beginning, although it is actually one of the most quoted, I think it is the most quoted part of the Mishnah. Like, this is a very, if you go and spend much time in a synagogue, they will probably reference this, multiple times within a month. Even in my workplace at a Jewish place, it was referenced, right? And I will actually delve more into that, hopefully in chapter 3. So just a little teaser. Okay, so the idea that there is a nuance between a friend, a teacher, and a friend, and that they are meant to fulfill different roles. Okay.
Can we say though, because I do think it's important, that I think a teacher can be a friend, but a teacher and a friend are two different expectations on a person. But sometimes they can be the same person.
You would be a very good point to speak to that, right? Like Don and I will sometimes make time to study, and that time he is more of my teacher. But there are also times when we are friend mode. We have different facets, and Don's usually he's like, I won't be clear about why someone's meeting with me. I'm asking you this as a friend, or I'm asking you this as your teacher. Don will be clear about what hat he's wearing, or try to make clear what hat am I expecting him to wear. This is not Hat Sunday, so I did not bring actual hats to demonstrate that with. Okay, so we'll move on. And again, if you have more questions, we can always talk about this more. Once we go through the 6 weeks, we can go through this again if you all want to. And I can be very prepared. Okay, verse 7. Nitier of Arbel said, keep away from a bad neighbor, do not fraternize with a wicked man, and do not abandon belief in divine retribution. So again, it sounds redundant, right? part of me is like, keep away from a bad neighbor. It's like, okay, who is my neighbor? What makes them a bad neighbor? Do not fraternize with a wicked man. It's like, well, can my neighbor also be a wicked man? Like, just like, in my head, I'm thinking about Jesus asking about, the good neighbor parable, Samaritan neighbor parable. It's like, well, isn't everyone my neighbor? Or is not the person I do good to? And the idea being that you're, all right, 7. Oh, that's not what I focused on. So there is a level of nuance that some of the commentaries go into, and I did not make notes about that, because I was like, I think I'll just, because I'm still working out my own thoughts of that. Yes.
You say, love your neighbor as yourself,
Yes.
and this is saying not to love your neighbor as yourself.
That's what it's saying. So that's, right, so we don't see it as a big tenet in Judaism, right, and in this congregation, love your neighbor as yourself, and here it's saying, right, keep away, do not fraternize, right, which I guess even those phrases are redundant. I think depending on your translation, that there's 3 in the chat, they might be a little more diverse. So, can you, what does it mean to love someone who's evil or wicked? Does it mean, is keeping away might be, can we still love someone while we keep away from them? If my wicked or evil neighbor still comes to me in need, do I still give them what they need? Do I still pray on their behalf? Do I still invite them to temple services? And, if this is saying in the time period of the text, right?
I think I'd also add that, my neighbor to my left, Fancy Pat, is with my son. We had another neighbor named Pat, and this guy is like that neighbor, except fancier, so my Malcolm called him Fancy Pat, and that now is stuck. But he is not a nice person. However, if there's ever a need, I will be there. But I don't go out of my way to interact with them, because it would be an unhealthy interaction, right? And so I'm kind. If they say hello to me, I say hello back. We have done nice things for them, but I don't. My other neighbors, I actually look out for them, go over and interact with them, and engage them intentionally about just the life that said, right? So I think there's a lot to that is, it's kind of like in the Proverbs where it says that only a dog returns to its vomit, right? Referring to relationships, that if you're in a bad or unhealthy situation, returning to that is not the best thing in the world. It's bad. So the same thing is true with a neighbor or someone who causes harm or disruption in your life. You shouldn't keep subjecting yourself to that. But in the same sense that if your enemy's donkey has fallen in a hole, in a ditch, I guess.
On the Sabbath.
On the Sabbath, big ditch. You're supposed to pull his ass out of that ditch, right?
That's not our new nickname for Coach. Big ditch.
So I think that's important. I think the other thing, and I'd be curious, and I'd have to look into it, but the word fraternize there, I believe, is also used to determine doing business with. It's not just interacting with, so don't do business with a wicked person. So if someone isn't honest or someone isn't just, and people aren't concerned about the well-being of others, as was just stated in this, in this section, you shouldn't do business with them. So I think that's also just a helpful clarification. So I don't think it's completely redundant. I think it kind of goes back to what Wade was saying earlier, how a lot of times in rabbinic writings, one thing builds off the next and it keeps. So the first one is, don't unnecessarily interact with someone who is unkind or rude or harmful to you. And the
next one is, don't do business, even if it could benefit you, don't do business with someone who is wicked.
And I guess to expand on that, right, is that, I was gonna say, oh, one sidebar, my abstract polyglot does not cover the above, so I did not go into a study of the Hebrew words. But right, so we talked about the idea of being in pairs, and this person, Nitier, pairs with the person before, Joshua, and what Joshua say? To judge every person favorably, right? So are these opposing views? What do those look like to try and do both? How do we learn from both of these and try and synthesize them together? How do we stay away and not fraternize with evil and wicked people while still judging them favorably and giving them the benefit of the doubt and assuming positive intent? Right. And especially, and I think it's interesting that they pair these two, right? Keep away from a bad neighbor, do not fraternize with a wicked person. So this might be someone who's done us harm, or someone who has the potential to do us harm. And then Nitier says, and do not abandon belief in divine retribution. Right? It's like, did I just see like your eyebrow kind of quirk at that? Maybe I'm just reading into it. Right? Like, what does divine retribution mean? Does it mean right, that we don't abandon the belief of it? They hope that God gives them their just deserts? Like, is that weighing in someone's favor? Or how does that go with the idea that God is all merciful?
Well, to me, the ends of the two lines both have to do with judgment and weighing. And the first one says, your job is to always judge in someone's favor. And let God be the ultimate judge.
Let God be God.
You know, and so don't abandon your belief that you need to take on judging. Like you can judge and misjudge someone favorably and then be hurt by them, but you have not done wrong in doing that. But don't give up the idea that God either doesn't have a right to judge or God will never judge, and therefore you have to. So that's how I read it, connecting those two and basically saying, always hold fast in God's judgment. And, you might doubt it because, Psalms and Proverbs are full, well, Psalms especially is full of David saying, why do you not judge the wicked? Why are they prospering? And Proverbs comes back and just basically says,
the sun shines on the ass and the dog, so
right, your job is not to judge, that I have not abandoned my hope that ultimately God's judgment, God is the one that judges, and the wisdom is letting that happen and not say, I'm wiser and therefore I should be judged.
Sometimes I'm comfortable, that's why I'm not right now. Okay, I'm gonna do a couple more. I don't think we're gonna get to the end. So moving on, number 8, verse 8. Yehuda ben Tabai and Simeon ben Shatta received the oral tradition from them. Yehuda ben Tabai said, do not act as a counselor when sitting as a judge. When the litigants stand before you, regard them both as guilty, but when they leave, having accepted the judgment, regard them both as guiltless. So some of the commentaries is just saying, as a judge, like, be impartial. Like, even if the lawyer navigated things so that you were able to be the judge of this, because he was hoping for a favorable outcome, still be impartial. If this happens to be some sort of tribunal where each party elects one judge and those 2 judges get a 3rd judge, don't ignore whatever party elected you and be nonpartisan. An idea of when they're both before you, regard them as guilty, right? It's like both parties let this issue get so bad that it had to be brought in front of a judge. Just, had to be needed in judgment. They were not, they did not show enough love or humility to avoid this being this significant. So in some ways, they have both fallen short and not done what they should. And then the last part, when they leave, we're going to quote this guiltless, which is just like, okay, it's all settled, now we're kind of clean slates. Questions or feedback, we move on.
I think that's where we as a country that says that we're wrapped in Judeo-Christian values really miss it, right? Because once a judgment is passed, the people accept the punishment. They carry the guilt. It stays on their record forever, as opposed to being reconciled to guiltlessness. And now, I understand the fear out of which we develop that process, which is repeat offenders or chronic abusers of that mercy, whatever. But I do think that we are missing something very significant within the Judeo-Christian tradition that basically says once you have exacted your punishment, once you've done it, once you've fulfilled it, you're good again. You're back to square one. And it's so conflicting to the way that Christianity teaches a lot of stuff, which is you're sinful just by being alive. And even when you're forgiven, you're still sinful. You're going to sin again. And the only thing that's happening is you're being forgiven, but your nature remains sinful. Whereas Judaism's approach to this I find to be way more beautiful, which is you sinned and therefore you're a sinner, and then you're forgiven and you're sinless. Christianity is you're a sinner, therefore you sin, you're forgiven, you're still a sinner, and you'll sin again. And that feels way more Sisyphusian with the sin rock, right? That you're rolling up a hill perpetually. So, anyhow, I just think that this is such a beautiful way. I would push back a little bit. I don't know if it's from commentary or your thoughts, Lee, about that in a court setting, everyone is guilty as she's done more. I don't think that that's quite that nice and neat, that both parties actually have committed some kind of offense. I understand why the rabbi said that, because the judicial system in those days was very different from ours, in that you did local mediation first, you took it to the village person who was in charge, and you took it outside that, and eventually you ended up in the judge. So in this setting, a judge would be more like the Supreme Court type thing.
You've been appealing a couple times.
Yeah, you've gone through the judicial process with several different levels first before you got to this place. So that would be the only other thing that I just think is important to note, that in ancient tradition, the process of mediation was way more systematic before you even stood before the judge.
Yes, and they said a Torah dispute, so I don't know how that would change the nuance. I mean, this Torah was their law, and yeah, so to be clear in this discussion, we can dig down a lot of questions and nitty gritty, because I do not know the context or time period of this guy at all. I know it's before Jesus, and that's about it. Sometime after the judges, and probably, somewhere during one of the kingdoms, maybe even between kingdoms. Anyway, so, right, and if there was a verse that really intrigues you, let me know. Again, I can come back to this after this is all over, and we can dig down into a couple of these questions more deeply. I can do, a word study. We could do it together if you wanted. Anyway, where am I? Verse 9. Simeon ben Shatta said, "Examine the witnesses thoroughly, and be cautious with your words, lest through them they, the witnesses of the litigants, learn to speak falsehood." they had like a whole like commentary backstory about why this was there. Where I'm not gonna repeat, but I'm like, okay. But this is just talking about like, as if you are a judge and you're giving a judgment on a case, make sure that you are examining the witnesses that come before you, that they are not falsifying, right, and be cautious with how you give your judgment, and how you believe the witnesses, and, less that you set a bad example, right? Unless you accidentally believe a false witness, and then, allow more faultlessness to kind of learn from that example. Okay, verse. Oh, okay, so we will wrap it up here. Again, I think number 9 is interesting, but yeah, if you would like, we need to meet next week, or we can go into part 2, or, it will be random unless I hear input, or we'll probably go to part 2 unless someone tells me otherwise. Okay, so I will wrap it up there.
Maybe you can start next week with part 2, but saying, is there any questions about the
Okay, great questions from part 1. Okay. So that will close out our teaching. Yes, we can stop.